All right, cool. We're live. So we usually give folks a minute or two to catch up with us, so we can continue our conversation about good local breweries that we love. No,
I like we were talking about sour beers and just searching those out because there aren't that many locally brewed sour beers. Not like the IPAs seem to be the thing everybody starts with.
They're catching on though, especially here in Loudon. I mean, Crooked Run, Ocelot.
Ocelot's got a great sour. I love their sour. Old Ox, Funky Face is an excellent.
Is a good sour, yeah.
Yeah, and they've got a couple of the Funky Face. I didn't even know that until I went there and I got the Margarita Funky Face. Right. There's like 3 or 4 different Funky Face varieties.
Yeah, they do different varieties with different fruits or different things, and you know, in the summertime, it's really refreshing.
I just got an emergency text from my mom that she is stationed on the patio, but she left her bottle of wine upstairs. So this is your official notice. You have time to go get that. This is everyone's like first call. Go get your bottle wherever you are.
Yeah. If you need to use the restroom, go now.
Right.
We're much more entertaining the more you drink. So have your mom please go get that bottle.
Ugh. No, I like a good sour.
Yeah, I feel like I've tried like all of the sours now in Loudoun County at this point. Although there's another brewery I want to go to, Wheatland Spring, which I've not been to yet, which has one and a few other good beers I want to go try.
I've heard great things. I have not been.
Yeah, I want to go soon.
Yeah. Now they do all their beers are made from locally grown produce and everything. I mean, they keep it like hyper local.
They do, yeah. I'm really curious to go check the place out. I know they're open now for limited seating, especially outside.
Is that down along 15? Is that where you see hops growing? There's a place.
No, that's
Vanish.
That's Vanish.
Yeah,
okay.
where you have the big hops field. No, Wheatland Springs is off of 287.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like on the other side of Waterford.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, we're good to go. As far as we're good to go. As soon as we are good with Andrea, then I think we can start rolling.
The wine has been secured.
I think so. I haven't received an update text yet, so everyone stay tuned.
We say nothing historical until we know your mom's drinking.
Yeah, until she's ready for it.
Andrea did give us the okay for the Loudoun Museum page, so we are, I think, on all platforms.
Great. All right, well then I'll go ahead and get the ball rolling tonight. Thank you all for joining us for another installation of Historians on Tap. As you know, this has been a weekly program for the last few months as we've tried to make it our way through this quarantine. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. Tonight's topic is Before They Were Famous. So we're going to be looking at some maybe famous or well-known folks, but looking back into their kind of how they got started or interesting stories about, you know, how they ended up where they ended up. So we're going to be covering a really broad range of history tonight. And tonight we, as our special guest star, we have Heidi Campbell-Shoaf. Heidi is the Museum Director and Chief Curator for the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum in Washington. Good friend of ours, and those of you who've been watching for a while might remember that her husband Dana was actually on probably 2 months ago now. It's been
1861 Hit Wonders
episode. So it's a pleasure to have you on here, Heidi. We're very excited for tonight.
It's good.
We saved the best show for last, I think.
That's right.
We're doing it.
Yeah, don't tell Dana, but you're our favorite.
I don't know, he might agree.
Right. So before we get started, let's take a quick run around the squares here and see what everyone is drinking. We'll start with my colleague Anne-Marie Paquette from the Mosby Heritage Area Association.
Tonight I'm drinking Black Ox. It's a rye porter from Old Ox Brewery. It's very tasty. Tonight I'm kind of telling a twofer story. So before they were famous, the White House Rose Garden and its designer Bunny Mellon. Gonna do a quickie there.
Cool. All right, Joe, what do you have on tap for tonight?
I am straying for the first time out of Loudoun County, and I'm going with Appalachian Brewing Company. Water Gap Wheat. I was up in Gettysburg recently and had to stop and pick up a 6-pack of some of the beers from Appalachian Brewing. And I am going to talk about a man named Albion Tourget. He spent some time in Virginia voluntarily, some time non-voluntarily, but he has a fascinating life story. He might even be better suited for why isn't he more famous because of all the work that he has done over decades. So that's what I'll be talking about.
Cool. All right, Heidi, what are you drinking tonight, and what will you be talking about?
Well, I went to Michigan. No, not literally, but Bell's Oberon Ale I'm drinking. So I like wheat beers and all those iterations made from wheat. So yeah, that's what I'm drinking. I'm going to be talking about someone who probably everybody knows, Louisa May Alcott, but her earlier life, pre-Little Women, and even pre-Civil War, and talking about one of my favorite things that she's written, which is not Little Women. So we'll find out about Louisa, and also my dog's named after her. So if you hear someone barking, that's Louisa.
Will she be? I was gonna say, is she gonna make a guest appearance on here tonight? Great. Well, I am drinking HOV. It's a blonde ale from Beltway Brewing. Very, very tasty, good for a summertime drink. And I will be telling the story of a grisly murder that leads to one of the more important civil rights cases of the early 20th century that has a surprising local connection to someone who becomes famous. So I don't want to spoil it quite yet. So as always, please in the comments, let us know what you're drinking, where you're watching from. If you have questions or comments for our historians tonight, please let us know. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Anne-Marie to get us started.
Great. I've been trying to figure out exactly how I'm going to structure this to not get too confusing. But I'm going to try and tell it in reverse chronological order. So a lot of folks are familiar with Bunny Mellon as kind of a style icon, as someone who is very engaged in politics later in her life, as someone who was a racing enthusiast alongside her husband, of course, Paul Mellon, an art collector, and of course, an avid gardener. And it's really that element of her life that brought her to a public national and international stage in the early 1960s with the Kennedys. So I'm going to start by kind of digging in there with the White House Rose Garden, which is what she had been asked to fix up. So in the early 60s, right after John F. Kennedy is elected to be president, he and his wife Jackie are in Upperville, Virginia. They are looking at real estate there. They hunt there recreationally, and Jackie kind of extends a social tickler, wanting to meet Miss Rachel Lambert Mellon, Bunny Mellon, to ask for her advice in redecorating the interior of the White House. Kind of woman to woman. Bunny is a generation older than Jackie. She is well known to have a very well appointed but modest looking home at the same time. And according to a recent newspaper article, until this time, in the last couple of administrations, the White House had been decorated so that it looked like a gangster's wake, was the phrasing that was used. So there was some sprucing up that needed to happen, some freshening up. And Jackie at this point, she's very young and she doesn't quite know how to wrap her head around it. And so by springtime of 1961, Bunny Mellon has already paid a visit to the White House, in which she was rummaging around in cabinets and in old cupboards and in White House storage. She was pulling out soup tureens and old pieces of pottery and random vases and just totally stuffing them with flowers of all kinds, not just formal flowers that you'd find in a state building, but also things like Queen Anne's lace and just little twigs that she might find outside in Washington, D.C. And very soon this became a new posh thing that people were taking notice of, and they were giving Jackie Kennedy credit for it, rightfully so, but because Jackie is the one who had contacted Bunny Mellon. And so this idea that you could have wild, but also formal, and you could be effortless and have flowers in a soup bucket, you know, it was a cool new thing. And so that's what set the stage between the Kennedys and the Mellons, really interacting more on a social scale. They both had houses in Cape Cod. They were both obviously also stationed in Upperville during various parts of the year. And so the families became close. They became good friends. And so it was in later that same spring, it was the same year, but it was September of that year in Cape Cod, when the Mellons invite the Kennedys over for lunch. And Jackie's on the phone with Bunny Mellon, and she says, Jackie's going to ask you a question, and I need you to say yes. Before he asks you what it is, I just need you to promise to say yes. And so Bunny Mellon, who is very kind of circumspect, she's very modest about her own abilities and attributes. She, okay, sure, whatever it is that I can do to help, I will do to help. And the Kennedys come over on their boat, and the first thing that Jack says when he gets off the boat is, I need you to make a garden for the White House. So you go from like putting Queen Anne's lace into a soup tureen to now redesigning a very important and soon to be public space for the President of the United States. And Kennedy had very specific ideas about what he wanted the Rose Garden to be and what he wanted the Rose Garden to look like. And yes, at this point, it is already known as the Rose Garden, even though for the past century and a half, it had gone through weird different iterations with each presidency. The grounds tended to change with each administration, and each president would often add a personal touch or personal buildings, especially in the outbuildings, to reflect whatever their tastes, styles, and needs were. So for example, we know that George Washington, before, he'd never lived in the mansion house, he already had interest in the landscape there, the architectural landscape there. But it was Jefferson who started putting that into practice. Adams hired the first real White House gardener, and so on and so forth. We know that Tad and Willie Lincoln had goats on the property, so every time someone new comes in, things tend to change around. And I actually have some photos of historically what this western side of the White House looked like, this western garden. So I'm going to screen share just so you guys can appreciate some of the interesting things. So before it even was a garden space, at one point it had been a stable yard. At another point, it had been an enclosed greenhouse, an orangery during the Jacksonian era. It was later made an actual rose garden near the turn of the century. This is during the Taft and Roosevelt administrations, this current view. So very, very early 20th centuries, we have these formal paisley-shaped beds is one way I've heard described, very geometric, but also very flat. Aside from the box hedge, there's not a whole lot of height interest here. About a generation later, during the Wilson administration, we get this new effort of colonial gardens. Of course, in the 20s, colonial gardens are all the rage. We see lots of box, we see lots of clipped hedgerows and geometric shapes, but this is still, a private / public space. Another view of this same garden, you can see in the bottom part of the screen, that's a laundry line that's hanging there. So there was, before this time, you can imagine the space that recedes further into the foreground here, there was a large patio space that was for drying linens or clothing or your household needs. So the idea
literally airing the president's laundry.
Exactly. Dirty laundry hanging out the White House. So it's a far cry from what we now think of as a rose garden. We're very formal, international level events are being held. And what Kennedy wanted was to have a space that was a garden, but could also have public functions there. He had just come back from an overseas trip to the Netherlands, France, Great Britain, and some of those European countries, and they all had formal governmental body garden spaces. And Kennedy knew, we have to do that. In fact, his campaign slogan was, we can do better. And that, I think, was his mentality going into this. And so what he wanted, and what Bunny ended up doing with the help of the Park Service, was to, of course, open up that whole lawn and then put in very specific plantings. And she said this in a 1969 interview about her overall aesthetic. And what she said about it was, nothing should be noticed, which is fascinating, but really works in terms of a gardener decor. You don't want to notice any one thing, right? You want to notice the scope. You want to know the feeling that you have in a space any more than any one thing. And so she gets the ask in September of 1961. She says, yeah, sure, talk to me. And then Kennedy says, let's set up a meeting in November. In November, she comes to the White House. She sits down, she looks at the space, she brings Irwin Williams with her, who was an NPS, the Aquatic Gardens director. He was their horticultural expert. And so she brings him in, they come up with some plans, and Kennedy says, okay, when can I have my garden? And so it's only a matter of, it's less than a year for when she decides to make the garden. She sits down to make a plan, and then there's actually a garden in place by the end of 62. Spring of 63 is when we see things finished up. So this is a view during 62. Here we have, of course, Caroline Kennedy on the famous macaroni. In the background, you can see, let me move this chat box. In the background, you can see not only the portico here, but you see a tree being brought in. You see it's still on its bulb. This is the garden. This is the rose garden mid-construction. They had to dig down 4 feet into the soil to do this, make a new bed of all fertile soil, and then bring in plantings. If you're going to have to make a fully grown garden in a year, you need to bring in big plants. And Bunny sourced 4 magnolias, 4 saucer magnolias with kind of the pink tulip flowers from the tidal basin. So they just went scouring around the district and actually plucked up plants that were already here. And then, of course, here's a view of the garden today. So before it was famous, it was many different things. As Bunny and Irwin were digging through this, this piece of the property, they found old brass horseshoes, iron horseshoes. They found shards of pots from the former orangery, and they also cut a really big, scary-looking table. And when they did that, hordes of Secret Servicemen came swarming into the garden because they had accidentally cut an emergency wire that the government had put in last minute during World War II, and they'd put it in so last minute they forgot where it was. Didn't actually have a map of where this cable was. So Bunny was much frightened by that, but Mr. Kennedy did not hold it against them for doing so. He was very curious if they found anything else, but nothing too scared. No too presidential dirty laundry kind of stuff was unearthed. So that in a very quick nutshell is that before the Rose Garden was famous, before the Rose Garden was what we know of it today. And the reason I wanted to tie it up with Bunny Mellon is, of course, that's what put her on to a much more public stage after the early 60s when she designed the Rose Garden. She was also contracted to then redo the East Garden on the opposite side of the Rose Garden. She was also more involved in other public projects as well. But she was by no means an unknown person in the early 1960s either. She was a much quieter, more circumspect person than her second husband, Paul Mellon, was. And many people associate her relationship with Northern Virginia, her relationship with the Heritage area in terms of Paul Mellon's collections, Paul Mellon's, their racing stables, not to say that Mrs. Mellon wasn't involved and interested in it, but Paul had a kind of a larger than life personality. And so sometimes folks, who have a Paul Mellon story, that they knew him in the community, that they interacted with him. Not as many folks have a Mrs. Mellon story, have a Bunny Mellon story. And I think that's really interesting. She had actually first come to this area to attend Foxcroft School. She's from, the New England. Her family has this huge house in Princeton growing up. Her father is the president of the Gillette Shaving Company in the early 20th century. Her grandfather invented Listerine, and they had a pharmaceutical company, but that was their only product for many years, was just Listerine. And then in the 20s, Gerard Lambert, Bunny's father, decided to redo the marketing strategy and make it a halitosis cure, which was apparently the bane of many young people's existence back then. Is I didn't even know I had to be afraid of this, and now I'm terrified of having bad breath and I'm going to buy Listerine. It was genius. So needless to say, the family is well off. They're doing fine. Bunny was supposed to go to Miss Porter's school, a private boarding school that her mother had attended. But by the time she was 15, Bunny was tired of, kind of that atmosphere of the school, not sure what exactly was about it, but she very quietly and determinedly went into her father's office before the next school year and, said, "Dad, I want to go to Foxcroft in Virginia." And her father later wrote that Bunny, in her very typical Bunny way, she had already thought through all the steps. She'd already thought through all of her arguments, and she was going to sit there and quietly tell you why she was going to do this thing until you agreed with her. She wasn't going to argue. She wasn't going to raise her voice or, use silly names, but she was going to get her way as politely as possible. And that was very much, a trait of Bunny's throughout her life. Her father, in return, says, "I've never heard of Foxcroft School. I've never heard of this." It was a small school. It was a small rural school in Virginia. It was run, of course, by Miss Charlotte. So the two, Bunny and her father, go down to the Plains to go do the interview to the school. And her father writes that he's actually really nervous because there are a lot of old families and a lot of families that are even wealthier than theirs who have their daughters going to Foxcroft School. And so he writes that he's sitting on this sofa, his knees are knocking together. Bunny is sitting very erectly in a little hard chair. Charlotte Nolan comes into the office and sits down, and Gerard starts making his pitch about, my daughter wants to go to your school and whatever else you do in a private school pitch. And Miss Charlotte just looks at him and then cuts him off mid-sentence and says, "Gerard, don't be a jackass. Of course your daughter can come to the school." It turns out that Charlotte Nolan had a friendship with Gerard's mother's family, the Lowes of Massachusetts, milling the fabric. So she had already made up her mind before even entering the room. I just love the very nervous, hat holding Gerard Lambert and Miss Charlotte, who is a well-to-do woman, but doesn't take any crap, wants to cut it down the middle, just saying, "Don't be a jackass. She can come to the school." So that started Bunny's relationship with Northern Virginia. She said she was terrified to ride, which was one of the biggest things about Foxcroft, but that she was really eager to do it anyways, to try and to keep going. And so it's that kind of modesty, but tenacity that I think a lot of folks remembered her for later in life. Incidentally, only a few years after that incident, 1926, in 1930, Gerard Lambert discovers that he is a distant relative of Nathaniel Burroughs. The Burroughs are, of course, a very old Virginia name, and the actual, descendant of the Burroughs in 1930 just happened to be selling Carter Hall in Millwood, only a few miles away from where Foxcroft was. So this was destiny, according to Gerard Lambert, who retired early, cashed in a lot of money, and purchased Carter Hall. So a lot of folks, if they know Mrs. Mellon from before, being Mrs. Mellon, they'll often associate her with Carter Hall. But she didn't even get there until after she had graduated from Foxcroft. But it's there at Carter Hall that she had her first greenhouse, which her father built for her so that she would have, you know, a productive hobby to do there at the house, and also something to, you know, to learn about. She was already very well read. She did not go to college or university, which is something that she kind of regretted later on, but at that time it wasn't expected. And so it's here that I think that that seed, was planted, in not just the outdoors being an outlet, that she of course got a lot of outdoorsmanship at Foxcroft, but then also the application of being in a greenhouse, being in a garden, designing a landscape around it, and how you do that well, you know. And she was also of course there at Carter Hall when they were doing the refurbishing of the original house. So then she again saw how to take, you know, the old into the new, and how do you meld them without noticing anything, kind of a thing. So that's what I wanted to leave everybody off with, was just that I think I got there quick enough, but that Bunny Melon, the Rose Garden before it was famous, and then Bunny Melon before she was famous, partially for doing their Rose Garden.
Cool. Thanks, Anne-Marie. So I'm also going to be telling a story from the early 20th century. I understand everybody's super into true crime stuff, so I hope everybody enjoys this, because it does get a little grisly.
Who doesn't
begin my story? What's that, Joe?
Love a good grisly story.
I know. The 13th of January, 1932, the small town of Middleburg, Virginia is rocked by an absolutely grisly murder. 2 women are found dead inside a home in town. One is Agnes Boeing Illsley. Agnes is a recently widowed, extremely wealthy socialite. She's part of this set that comes down from the north to the hunt country of Virginia in the early 20th century. Very, very well known, well liked, very popular in the highfalutin social scene of Middleburg. And also her housekeeper, 65-year-old Mina Buckner. Both are found inside the home, bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, as it turns out, was a cast iron boot scraper in the shape of a large beetle, which, you know, just the descriptions of the crime scene are horrific. I don't really want to get into them. But needless to say, this was absolutely, you know, earth-shattering for the people of Middleburg. Middleburg is to this day not a very large town, and to have 2 brutal murders take place really freaked everyone out. Now, suspicion almost immediately fell on a young African-American man named George Crawford. Crawford had a kind of checkered past. He had been employed by Miss Illsley as a chauffeur, but just a few months earlier, in September of 1931, witnesses had seen the 2 get into an argument. Supposedly, Crawford was accused of having stolen some liquor from the liquor cabinet. Upon this suspicion, he was fired. And, you know, suspicion was raised once again right around Christmas of 1931, just a few weeks before the murder, when the Illsley house had been broken into, and, you know, furs and jewelry and some other things were stolen. You know, and needless to say, this is Jim Crow era Virginia. So, you know, it didn't take much to convince the public or the press that Crawford was the #1 suspect. And, you know, at this point in time, they really didn't even bother to investigate anyone else. You know, immediately from within a few hours of the bodies being discovered, a manhunt is started. Now, the only thing really missing from the home was Mrs. Illsley's car. So initially, robbery was not thought to be a motive. But like I said, the manhunt was on. The local papers pretty much immediately started calling for Crawford to be lynched. You know, there's no polite way of putting that. They basically put it out there that if this guy's caught, you know, if he murdered 2 white women, he should be killed. And that was reinforced by one of Mrs. Illsley's good friends in the Middleburg area, Billy Mitchell, who, of course, you know, we all know is the, you know, kind of pioneer of aerial warfare, you know, advocate for bombers and kind of aerial warfare in the interwar period. He literally comes out and says that if the posse that he's leading catches Crawford, he will be burned at the stake. So the stakes are incredibly high, and nobody can find George Crawford. They do find Illsley's car in Alexandria not long after the murders take place, but there's no sign of the number one suspect. This hunt goes on for a year, and it's literally a year to the date, January 13th, 1933, that a man is arrested in Boston for stealing $8 from a store. And upon interrogation, we find out that it is George Crawford, the same man who's wanted for this murder in Loudoun County. And this is where the story gets really crazy, because they interrogate Crawford, and in his interrogation, he supposedly admits to being present at the murder. He says, we went there to break into the house, we went there to rob the house, but it was not me who killed the two victims. He blames that on an associate of his, a guy he met kind of on the road named Charlie Johnson. Now, nobody knows who Charlie is or where this guy's from. He just says it's a man he met in Washington, and they formed this plan to break into the house. And it was Charlie who actually kills the two victims when he realizes that there's someone in the, kind of a robbery gone wrong. Now, I say supposedly because almost immediately after giving this testimonial, he retracts his story and he says, no, I was nowhere near Middleburg. I was in Boston. I have witnesses who can say that I was in Boston when these murders occurred. And this is when the case starts to attract some wider attention. The first organization to get involved is a group called NERL, the National Equal Rights League. They start picking up on this case. And then eventually the NAACP will also take notice, because here we have an African-American man accused of murdering two white women in Virginia. He's in Massachusetts when he is arrested. And they make the argument that there's no way this man can receive a fair trial in Virginia, especially when literally the local press is calling for him to just be murdered. When local people in the Middleburg area are calling for him to be lynched. And this really gets at the heart of the importance of this case. Since they kind of latch onto this idea, African Americans are barred from serving on juries in Virginia, as they are throughout most of the South. Therefore, there's no trial by one's peers. There's no kind of expectation of equal protection under the law. There's a denial of due process, a violation of one's 14th Amendment rights. All of these arguments get put forth by the NAACP, and this is enough to convince a federal judge in Massachusetts not to extradite George Crawford. He refuses to send him back to Virginia because he says if this guy gets to Virginia, he's going to die without any fair due process. And it's not really about his guilt or his innocence. It's about, does he get a fair chance at, a trial, something that is constitutionally guaranteed. And this becomes so contentious that there's actually a movement within the House of Representatives to have this federal judge in Massachusetts impeached. Basically, every Southerner in the House of Representatives gets up in arms about this and move to impeach this judge, because basically they make the argument, well, then all of our courts are, invalid. We can't try an African American in this. I mean, they kind of make the argument for them, for themselves. But I mean, it also starts to raise the specter in Southern courts that if this becomes enough of an issue, this is going to make it all the way to the Supreme Court. And there have already been rumblings about this. And, this could potentially overturn a lot of convictions within the South, that these men were denied due process and equal protection under the law. So eventually, the judge's decision is overruled by the appeals court. Crawford is extradited, and in the fall of 1933, he will be sent back to Virginia. The man who will take up his defense is an incredibly influential legal scholar, person a lot of you maybe have not heard of, but incredibly influential, named Charles Houston. Houston in the early 20th century is the most experienced and well-respected African-American lawyer in the country. He's the dean of Howard University's law school at this point. He's had a lot of experience in kind of these early civil rights cases in the first decades of the 20th century. And he is going to be put on this case by the NAACP, and he's going to lead the first all-Black defense team in any murder trial in the South. It's a really kind of watershed moment. And what he does is, as they're going through the pre-trial kind of rigmarole and selecting juries and things like that, he will step by step, very professionally, examine every part of the jury selection process and get to the heart of, well, why are there no African Americans on this jury? He says, here's a list of Loudoun County African American men who own property. Why are they not, on this jury? Why is the jury pool? And he really dissects it from every single step. And that's going to play a huge role in the trial to follow. Houston does not manage to get an integrated jury. The judge kind of, as they go through this weeks of trying to select a jury, the judge does not relent. But what it does is it calls an incredible amount of not just local attention, but national attention to how these people are systematically kind of disenfranchised from the judicial system. So once the jury selection is complete, the trial begins. They literally have to arm state police with like rifles and tear gas to keep the crowds away from the courthouse, because there's this fear that people are just going to rush in and lynch him. Now, literally, there had been a lynching in nearby Fauquier County just a few months earlier. There's a while this is all going on, there's a highly publicized lynching in Maryland's Eastern Shore. So this is very much the kind of environment that this is taking place in. Now, as the trial progresses, George Crawford's alibi really starts to fall apart. He again makes this claim that he was in Massachusetts. Like, that's not the case. There are witnesses that don't necessarily put him at the scene. Nobody sees him actually go in and commit the murder or anything like that, but people had seen him in the area. Someone had seen him in Washington just a few days afterwards. There was a note found in Mrs. Isley's car that was attributed to him. So the evidence is likely that he had something to do with the crime. Now, whether he was telling the truth that he was there and it had attempted to rob the place, and that this other guy, Charlie Johnson, had committed the actual murders, we'll never know. We will never know. But again, the importance is bigger than George Crawford here. The importance is that Charles Houston is calling attention to kind of the defects in the legal system here in Virginia. Houston is going to make an impassioned plea on the last day of the trial, December 16th. In his closing argument, he basically says, you can, any African-American man accused of murdering 2 white women in Virginia is going to face the death penalty. And he makes a very compelling argument that if he's telling the truth and that this Charles Johnson guy actually committed the murders, then he's the only person who could ever identify him and bring the true killer to justice. So if you kill George Crawford, true justice may never happen, may never be reached. And that was enough. The jury deliberates for an hour and 45 minutes. They kind of poll the jury 3 times. There's 3 people holding out for the death penalty. The rest say no, life in prison. And then finally, after the third vote, the jury agrees that he is guilty, but that he will serve life in prison. Now, this may not seem like much of a victory, but to Charles Houston, this is absolutely progress. Not only does this man escape with his life, essentially. He is punished for his role in whatever happened that January night. But he was not just outright lynched or just sent straight to the electric chair, but that he gets what Charles Houston considers a fair trial. He considers this a partial victory, very important moment. Not only is it the first all-black legal team to represent a murder case in the South, it also, because of a lot of what went on before the trial, lays the groundwork for future challenges against segregated juries. And this is enough of a threat that within the next few years, juries all across the South, courts will start to look at this and say, it's not worth years and years and years of legal challenges or the threat of cases being thrown out in the Supreme Court or in a federal appeals court to do this. And so within the next year, Loudoun County will actually have its first African Americans serving on the jury. And this is going to carry on throughout the South, especially after 1935, when Charles Houston again represents, this time at the Supreme Court, where he will argue in the case of Hollins v. Oklahoma, which is the Supreme Court case that finally strikes down segregated juries in the South. And this case comes directly out of his experience with the murder trial of George Crawford. So it's a small local trial that ends up blossoming into this huge nationwide movement with deep ramifications. And that's actually the first Supreme Court trial that is argued by an all African American legal team. Now,
quick question for you from Facebook. Sharon was curious, is the trial in Leesburg or is it in Middleburg?
It's in Leesburg. It's at the courthouse in Leesburg. Yep. Yeah, one of the interesting things is Houston and his legal team can't get lodgings in the town of Leesburg because it's segregated. They can't eat at any of the restaurants. They actually eat their meals in the back of the black-owned barbershop in town because there's no place that will accept them. One of the kind of more surprising things that comes out, though, is the local media, who, as I said, is kind of predisposed against Crawford. They do go, as the trial goes on, really commend Houston and his team for their professionalism, for their ability to argue this case, and the prosecutors actually do the same. They're incredibly impressed with the professionalism and the attention to detail that they present. And a big part of that is because of the legal team that Houston has assembled. He's the dean at Howard University. So a lot of his students are going to be clerks and researchers on his legal team. And, since our theme tonight is before they were famous, one of the clerks who did a ton of research into the crime and into the evidence and that was presented in this trial is a young man who had just graduated, one of his students named Thurgood Marshall. So this is one of the first legal trials that Thurgood Marshall is present at. And he actually writes to Thurgood Marshall. He actually writes in letters and memoirs later, he said, this trial, the George Crawford murder trial, was a watershed moment in his life. That this proved that a Black man could receive a fair trial in the South. He also had a lot to say about Charles Houston. Basically everything good he ever learned about the law was from Charles Houston. Although he said he was kind of a hard ass. The nickname for him was Iron Pants and Cement Shoes. So I think that really speaks to Charles Houston as a teacher. Famously, he gave Marshall and the rest of his class a lecture on their first day as students, saying, 2/3 of you are going to fail out before you finish this. So it really speaks to the man's professionalism, his drive, his perfectionism.
What a motivational speaker.
Yeah.
People fail miserably. But
Well, obviously,
You're teaching a course soon, Joe, aren't you?
yeah, I usually tell them over half are going to fail.
Yeah.
yeah, right. I mean, it obviously had a positive impact on Thurgood Marshall because he took that lesson to heart, graduated at the top of his class, goes right into assisting with this murder trial. and from there builds a reputation. In 1954, obviously he's arguing Brown versus Board of Education in front of the Supreme Court, and then a few years later in 1967, the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court. So it's interesting to think that road to the Supreme Court led through Leesburg.
Very cool.
Yeah. And if anybody wants the gruesome details of the murder, there are books on it. You can read a book.
There's a pretty extensive, really dissects it for you.
Yeah, David Bradley, The Historic Murder Trial of George Crawford, really goes into not just the crime itself, but the national importance of it, and really how it's the first domino to fall in kind of getting rid of this, all-white Southern juries. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's fascinating to go through and look at the local newspapers too, from the murder itself, but then also their reaction to this very significant change.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, from
hard to transition from.
Yeah, I hope you have a happier story for us, Heidi.
Me?
Yeah, you're up.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Seriously, this doesn't involve any murders or assaults or anything.
I mean, we can look at things to cheers.
Yeah, I'll have a beer for that. We need a palate cleanser.
No murder.
So when you asked me to come up with something about before they were famous, I was just kind of thumbing through my internal Rolodex, and one of the things that I really enjoy is reading historical fiction, but from a historian's point of view, someone who likes material culture. So I am not a literary critic. I was hopeless in literature classes in college. I don't get all of the symbolism. That's not where I'm going with this. But I enjoy Louisa May Alcott's writing. Not so much Little Women. I think everybody's talked that to death, please. And but
hot take.
I know, I don't have the alarm ready. Little Women just got buried by.
Yeah, Heidi Campbell-Shoaf says Little Women sucks.
Yeah, well, seriously, I mean, come on, it's sort of, it fits in a nice little slot that we want to put in women authors and women in general in the 19th century. It's just like, oh, isn't it nice? A nice little story about
women. It's about sisters and they get along in the end.
Yeah.
Yay.
Well, Louisa May Alcott has a different side to her. She was, I'm sure some of the people probably listening to this know that she was a nurse during the Civil War. She went down to Washington, D.C. She was a nurse in Georgetown, in a hospital in Georgetown, starting in 1861, but she gets typhoid and after about 6 weeks, and so ends up going back home, and she writes hospital sketches, which is a great story. It's a novelized version of her experiences during the war in the hospitals. But before even that, she was writing all kinds of short stories and literature because her family was basically destitute. I think the image that she creates in Little Women is too genteel for how they were living in the 1860s, the 1850s, the 1840s, mainly because her father, Bronson Alcott, who was a transcendentalist, there's a graduate school word, right? He had his head in the clouds, basically. And so my story is about her experiences and how she writes about them. And one of my favorite books by her, called can you see it? It's hard to read. Transcendental Wild Oats. It's a short story, and she writes, it's actually satire. She writes about their experience in a utopian community, which was all the rage in the 1840s, called Fruitlands. And Fruitlands it's a historic site now, actually, you can go visit it. Bronson Alcott and his friends came up with this society. And if you don't know about the early 19th century, there were a lot of reform movements going on, and a lot of efforts at creating a better, I guess, social structure. And so there are, like the Oneida community is one, the Shakers is another one, a very famous one. And so Fruitlands is one that her father and her mother, because she's married to her father, gets drawn into, along with Louisa and her sisters. And so Louisa, let's see, they were at Fruitlands in 1844. Louisa is born in 1832, so you do the math, she's about 12. And what's really cool about this volume, actually, is that it includes some of her Fruitlands diary. And it shows, even at the age of 12, how she is such an accomplished writer and how she describes people and events. So you can see where her inspiration for this story comes from. But she doesn't publish this short story until 1873, after Little Women. So I think this is interesting, and I haven't found why she did this, because this is for sure going to get people to read it, right? I mean, Little Women's a bestseller. She writes the book, she saves the family from basically literally starving to death because she writes the book, which is another interesting story, because she didn't want to write Little Women. She didn't want to write a book about little girls, for little girls. She was all into like Gothic novels and things like that. She wrote it because her father had written a book, and the publisher wasn't going to publish her father's book unless the publisher could get her to write a book, because he knew that would sell. Her father's book on transcendental stuff wasn't going to sell. So anyway, interesting.
I like to think of them being sold as a box set of like Little Women and this transcendentalist type piece.
Ridiculous transcendentalist garbage. Like.
So anyway, she writes this this short story called Transcendental Wild Oats, and it is satire. You can tell it's satire. And she writes, and she doesn't even, she comes up with different names for everybody, but she doesn't even hide the fact that this person is actually this real person. So, Charles Lane is Timon Lyon, Bronson Alcott is Abel Lamb, it's so in the story, everybody knows who everybody else is who has been involved. And basically what happens is that, and this is so much like what actually did happen in Fruitlands, is that all of these men who were thinking big thoughts, and they were going to go on to this in this commune basically, and they were going to grow everything. They're going to have, eat from the land, and they're not going to consume anything that was going to do harm to people. And it finds out, I'll read you just two little bits from this, and you'll get a really good idea of what was going on. Let's see. Okay, this is what they were deciding to eat. Unleavened bread, porridge, and water for breakfast. Bread, vegetables, and water for dinner. Bread, fruit, and water for supper was the bill of fare ordained by the elders. No teapot profaned that sacred stove. No gory steak cried aloud for vengeance from the chaste gridiron. And only a brave woman's taste, time, and temper were sacrificed on the domestic altar. And that brave woman was Louisa's mother.
Yeah.
She was the one that had to make all of this stuff. And so they had these grand ideas that they were going to grow everything. And it said, here's them trying to sow, they were going to sow wheat to make all of this unleavened bread. It's like the sowing was equally peculiar, for owing to some mistake, the three brethren who devoted themselves to this graceful task found, when about half through the job, that each had been sowing a different sort of grain in the same field. A mistake which caused much perplexity, as it could not be remedied. But after a long consultation and a good deal of laughter, it was decided to say nothing and see what would come of it.
Neat.
Yeah, I mean, they started spading the garden, thinking, all right, they're not going to use any animals because that was imposing on the animals. And
yeah,
so,
we can impose on our wives.
Yes.
But
But
not a cow,
animals,
yeah.
we have
No.
standards here.
Yeah. So the men got out their hoes and their spades, and they're turning the soil, and then they find out this is really hard work. And so they decided, well, maybe we could get some oxen in here just to do it for this time, because everybody was getting sore because everybody was these thinkers. You know, people like that, right?
I myself am more a thinker than a plowman myself.
I would definitely fall in that category as well.
You think, well, how hard could it be, right? And then when in practice, you're just like, whoa. But with these people, it wasn't just, some hobby. They gave everything up. They're on this like farm. There's no food coming in. There's no money. And they're literally starving to death.
Yeah.
And
there's no tea. There's no tea.
There's no tea.
Barbarian.
There's no coffee. There's nothing.
Yeah, I'm no coffee.
No beer.
No
beer.
No. And so this the main proponent, this as she calls it, Timon Lion, he decides that this wasn't going to work, and right before winter happens, he goes off and hangs out with the Shakers.
Yikes.
And this is literally true. I mean, this guy Lane decides he's going to go with the Shakers, and the Shakers even wrote, like, this guy has come and they seem to be interested in our customs and our practices. It's like, no, he's waiting for the winter to pass, someplace that actually has food.
He's interested in our customs of eating meals.
Yeah, right. So I think this is really interesting that she creates this story from this memory that she has and these notes that she's written of, and completely skewers this utopian community. Yeah, utopian. Who is it? A utopia, And she shows that really the hero of the whole story is her mother, because her mother figures out a way how to get everybody, all the family, out of there before they freeze and starve to death. And she's the one who figures out that we can go with Reverend Lovejoy, and she's going to sew and mend and do laundry, and the Aunt Bronson Alcott can do some light gardening and things like that, until spring comes and they can get back on their feet again. But I think that this shows that Louisa May Alcott, who we think was just this, author of Little Women, had a really clear view and realistic and practical view of the world. And that so many people that she was very tight with, and she was educated by, Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller, and that she took some of all this transcendental fluff and brought it back down into practicality. And I think that is what you see in her book, Transcendental Wild Oats. It's like, this isn't working, people.
Yeah.
And it also, because she was an early feminist, it also shows how much is put on the shoulders of women to make things work. And I think that the story, you know, the Little Women story shows the same kind of thing, where all of these women, it's their story. It's not the story about Lori or, you know, the father. It's the mother and the girls. And it's something that is sometimes overlooked, I think. So that's my Louisa May Alcott story.
Here's to Mrs. Alcott for getting them out of that situation.
Yeah, get out. Get out of there. Cheers to those oxen who got a sweet gig not pulling a plow.
Well, and in the story, the oxen actually doesn't turn out to be oxen. One's an ox and one's a cow. And then there was this whole debate about, oh, I don't know if we can use a cow because cow gives milk and we're not allowed to drink milk. And we can't, you know, it was just like one thing after another. And you feel like, come on already, you know? This isn't gonna work. No.
I love the image too of like a 12-year-old Louisa May Alcott, like clearly seeing what's going on. Like, is this really what grown men are doing right now?
Yeah, she can see through the BS even at that age, which is great.
So
I would watch a show about like a documentary, like a mockumentary. I would watch that.
Yeah. I recommend it. It's on Google Books. You can find it online. You can read it. It's not long, but it reads quickly. There's not a lot of strange, you know, sentence structure or anything like that. So it's a fun. I think it's a fun read.
Yeah, sounds like it. You know, my wife is actually named after a character in Little Women. She's named Beth, which I always thought was really cute and sweet until she pointed out that Beth is the one that dies in the story.
Yeah.
I was like, that's a little grim.
Well, in the biography, that this most recent biography of Alcott, it talks about how her publisher wanted Joe to get married. Joe needed to get married. Well, she needed to get married, and how Louisa was just like, why? She doesn't need to get married. And as we know, Louisa never got married. And it's this, you know, they're talking, you know, 1860s here, but still, I'm sure authors today get that same argument.
You need a love interest.
Editors and publishers, you know, but it needs to be, because they want to turn everything into a love story, you know, or, you know, how is it not valid if you're not married? It must not be valid.
Well, I also like that then the answer is just, she can be valid in marriage or in death. And like, that's kind of, those are your options.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, and it's a totally inappropriate question, so bear with me. With a lot of these transcendental utopian communes, there are some pretty weird ideas going around about like free love,
bedroom
and, like,
stuff,
polyamory, and like all kinds
or no reproduction,
or not at all. Yeah,
right?
Like
It's one of two extremes.
Yeah. So, is this one of those cults?
It doesn't seem to be. No. Because the transcendentalists, at least the earlier ones, they were like an offshoot of the Unitarians, and so they didn't go so far as, say, like Margaret Fuller and some of the free love folks. In this short story, I don't think there was any mention of whether or not anybody could or could not have sex. It was more about how they were not going to consume things that imposed a hardship on others. So they weren't going to wear clothes made out of cotton because of the slave trade. They weren't going to consume sugar because of the slave trade. They weren't going to wear wool because that imposed discomfort on sheep.
So linen? Like, is linen all
linen was the thing. That was, they decided they were going to wear linen. That was
it's
bad
made
for
by
sheep to not
worms.
get sheared.
It is.
Like, that's what I thought.
Shorn.
Yeah, shorn. Yeah.
Yeah. Shorn.
That's
Shorn.
interesting
Yeah.
because I've read a lot about. I'm trying to think of the word that they used in the late 18th century, but Quakers who refused to eat sugar and things like that. There's kind of this like moral consumption.
Yeah,
idea
it's like
going
it's a
around.
whole boycott mentality of the
Mhm.
slave trade. And I never thought about putting that together with, a commune style new wave.
Mhm.
Hey, Heidi, a question.
Yeah, and the
You can go ahead. I have a question from Facebook I was going to ask.
okay.
So I was just curious about the relationship between Abigail Alcott and Charles Lane. Do you know anything about that?
Charles Lane was that was Timon Lyon in the story. And Charles Lane and his son stayed with the Alcotts in real life for about a year or so before they went to Fruitlands. From what how Louisa sees it, they didn't get along. They were just kind of like, they didn't not Louisa and Charles, but Abba and Charles, or Abba as they called it, and Charles. She did not want, really, I think if it were up to her, she wouldn't be going there with him there. I don't know so much about if there was some other dynamic going on, but I think a lot of it, from what I can read from what Louisa says, it's more about their life is hard enough as it is, and Lane was just freeloading.
Yeah, he's more dead weight.
Yeah. Not just Lane, but Lane and his son William, both. Yeah. They were kind of freeloading on this family who was scraping by as it already was.
And then they freeload off the Shakers.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, Louisa, I was going to say something else about her. Little bit of trivia about Louisa May Alcott. She was the first woman to register to vote in Concord, Massachusetts, when Massachusetts allowed local women to vote in local elections in the 1870s. She was the first woman to sign up and register to vote.
I will cheers to that.
Yeah, in this suffrage year.
That's right.
That's true. It is.
Nice.
All right, Joe, take us home.
All right. Well, my story actually fits in terms of the literary sense with Heidi's, with the civil rights sense, the legal sense like Travis's. So I want to talk about Albion Tourget. And when we decided on this topic, I planned on talking about Oliver Wendell Holmes, who, fights at the Battle of Ball's Bluff, goes on to this long career. And I kept coming back to thinking about Albion Tourget, who I remember reading about when I was working at Manassas Battlefield. And we did a program about Matthews Hill, myself and another park ranger, and he was one of the people we spotlighted. And it was just a fascinating career, a guy who moves all over the place. I know we have a few people from the Western New York area that watch. He also spends some time there. I'll mention in a bit. So I figured I'd talk about him just because of this fascinating story that he really has. And he's born in 1838 in Williamsfield, Ohio, an area that has a very strong anti-slavery sentiment. His family moves to Western Massachusetts when he's young, and Albion ultimately ends up going to the University of Rochester for school. And it's there that I think his enjoyment for arguing, or maybe like getting involved into debates, really comes to fruition, especially during the election of 1860, when a kind of almost military group called the Wide Awakes in support of Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans, is formed. They're banned by the University of Rochester. Tourget then kind of sticks up in their defense and gets into a battle with the university president about it. And ultimately a compromise is formed about that. But part of it might just be arguing, but also part of it is having a strong anti-slavery sentiment that Tourget's grown up with. And in the spring of 1861, when the war is beginning, units are raising in May, he joins the 27th New York, both to preserve the Union and also for anti-slavery sentiment. And like a lot of individuals, he's got no experience in military really before this. So that spring, they're trying to figure out how to become soldiers too. And there's always good stories that come out from units that are raised and in their first months of training. And there's one that doesn't directly involve Tourget, but from the 27th New York that I remember from working at Manassas. Like a lot of units, they were waiting, figure out what happens, and they were given their rations. And they were given a very kind of outdated rations of beef. And for the 27th, when they open up the rations, as one soldier said, quote, it was a little too fresh and lively. By this point. So within the 27th, they re-close off the regimental rations of beef. They nail it shut. They then get a procession in line for this beef. They play the tune of the Rogues March, and they have a funeral procession that leads to an orchard. And once they get to the orchard, then they, quote, give it with all honors of war, they bury the rank meat. They have eulogists speak, and they have this quite the demonstration for this rank beef.
May I? So if my mother is watching, she is probably cackling right now because as a young child, we were left home for dinner while my parents went to engagement, and the stuffed peppers we had were so not yummy that we did that thing. It wasn't lively, there weren't any bugs in it, but we also had a funeral procession with songs and eulogies out to the backyard to bury it. So I empathize with this situation is what I want to say.
Well, I hope she found that bottle of wine early on after kind of giving this dirty laundry of the McCaff family.
Sorry.
All coming out tonight, huh?
It's all coming up.
It really is. Yeah. So again, eulogists give these speeches for it. The commander does not appreciate this and calls over one of the eulogists. And the private, the eulogist replied, "I never knew that beef had any particular rank when being called out for this breach of authority." I hope he wanted that pun to be intended when saying the rank comment. But for the 27th, they're involved at the Battle of First Manassas, first time in war, like most have that situation. And Tourget, they fight on Matthews Hill particularly, so the first stage of the Battle of First Manassas. But it's part of the retreat that a gun carriage runs into Tourget and temporarily paralyzes him. He has terrible back pain from this. He's discharged from the army, but then the next year, when he starts to feel better, he's getting more movement back, he rejoins the army, but now in the 105th Ohio. I think I've got a picture of him in the 105th.
Cool hat.
Those are some jaunty looking dudes right there.
Yeah,
I like that. Yes,
So that is
yeah, some hardy hats.
So that's supposedly Albion Tourget on the left, and when I'll show you a picture later on in his life, and it looks pretty similar to him, just aged a little bit.
I like the guy on the right, like that contrapposto kind of a, I don't know.
Those Western regiments had a swagger, and I appreciate that. I'm here for that.
The guy on the right's definitely trying to give off the vibe like he's too cool to be taking this photo and to like wait.
Yeah.
Dude, I love this. That's awesome.
So again, he rejoins now. That's the 105th Ohio. Again, he was born in Ohio. So he's taking part in the Battle of Perryville. He gets captured, not in Kentucky during the battle. I think in Tennessee actually gets captured. He spends several months at Libby Prison in Virginia. So that's when I mentioned he was involuntarily also in the state. Gets exchanged, and then I think he's at the Battle of Chickamauga. But after that, his back is still giving him problems. So he leaves the army. So he spends the last 2 years of the war going back and getting education. He becomes a journalist. And I believe he gets like a master's and studies the law as well in those 2 years. After the war in 1865, he views there being potential in moving south. Again, the South in shambles. So he moves to Western North Carolina near the Greensboro area. And as you are well aware, Northerners moving south just after the war is not necessarily smiled upon. The idea of carpetbaggers, of course, as a derogatory sense for these individuals, whether they're going down for capitalizing on businesses potential or for sincere reasons, and his are more sincere. That's still a tough go of it if you're a Northerner moving to the South and being very active, which he is. And he gets very involved in civil rights and pushing for freedmen's rights, equal rights for African Americans in North Carolina. He edits two radical Republican newspapers. Early on in the 1860s, he organizes the Loyal Reconstruction Leagues. So he's very much involved in local politics and local law. He also is a key figure becoming involved with the laws and changing the laws in Reconstructed North Carolina. He's a central figure in the latter part of the 1860s for democratizing the local laws in North Carolina and for changing the judicial system. So he's very heavily involved in North Carolina. And because of, well, not because of necessarily changing the laws, he's a very critical figure, but because he's a Northerner and because he's a Republican, he was considered, quote, by a historian, quote, for many years, the most thoroughly hated man in North Carolina. Because while he was changing the laws, he was also battling against those trying to limit Reconstruction. He takes on the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina. He sees the violence of the Klan head on. He experiences it directly. In just 1871, for example, alone, he indicted 63 Klansmen.
Wow.
Whoa.
Yeah, so he is heavily involved in not just trying to bring equal rights to North Carolina for freedmen, but also fighting against the kind of backlash against those amendments and then Reconstruction policies. Of course, though, as we know, Reconstruction ends in 1877. That then really limits Tourget's ability on a legal sense and political sense to enact some of these changes. He does run for Congress in 1878, but again, when you think about end of Reconstruction and what that means for voting rights, he has no chance in order to win that race. I mean, he's completely running without a chance, especially with African Americans being intimidated from the vote. I mean, he receives death threats. He actually writes letters to loved ones and friends on the assumption that he's going to be murdered. His wife is convinced that he's going to be assassinated by the Ku Klux Klan and by angry North Carolinians in the 1870s. So of course he loses that. And with Reconstruction ending, with threats to his family, and really just a kind of a hopelessness kind of feeling, it seems like that's multiple of the reasons why he leaves North Carolina and why they move out of the South. But that doesn't end his career. He's still very much fighting for civil rights in the 1870s and 1880s. But it's in 1879 that he writes a book called A Fool's Errand by One of the Fools. And it's historical fiction, but it's based on his experiences directly with Reconstruction in North Carolina. And this book becomes a huge sensation throughout the country, particularly with the North. It makes him a lot of money. He becomes a much more well-known figure because of this. And then it's when he moves to Mayville, New York, right off of Lake Chautauqua. I spent a lot of time, I have friends who live in the Lake Chautauqua area, so now I've got to go find where this house was and ultimately where his grave is, he's buried there, which I'll explain later. But he's a well-known figure. He continues to write when he's in Mayville, New York on Lake Chautauqua. He writes novels. He's involved both with newspapers, but also historical fiction and fiction. But nothing quite comes to the level of success like A Fool's Errand. Also in the 1880s, he is writing editorials for a Chicago newspaper, and he made a lot of connections by African Americans in the South who then write to him and report some of their experiences that aren't making the news, so he can then help report those as well. But it's in the 1890s that he becomes really a national figure beyond that well-known book. It's because in the late 1890s, he gets involved with civil rights activists in Louisiana who want to challenge the segregation laws. And he agrees and voluntarily becomes the chief counsel for Homer Plessy for Plessy versus Ferguson.
Oh.
Yeah, so he is
Cool.
a central figure in that for making this defense against segregation to the Supreme Court. And within his case that he argues, he also makes very famous the phrase kind of colorblind constitution or colorblindness in terms of the law. That gets misconstrued in the 20th century and used for other motives, but it becomes well known during Plessy versus Ferguson. But he's not the first time using it in there. It's actually something he'd been using for decades, and that phrase actually goes back to the 1830s with abolitionists. But he uses it multiple times in the Reconstruction North Carolina, this idea of colorblind law and constitution. So during the case, again, he's trying to make this a referendum on the Reconstruction Amendments, again, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but ultimately only one dissenting vote on the Supreme Court. But that dissenter on the Supreme Court uses the phrase colorblindness, and it seems like for a while got credit for that phrase, even though, of course, it was Tourget's and even goes back well before that in the late 1890s. But even though it ends in failure, and it doesn't get changed until Brown versus the Board of Education, where again, they look back at the arguments of a legal case against segregation, and the Supreme Court during Brown reverses it, saying that Plessy versus Ferguson was wrong, and they give a complete reversal of it, with that case ending the idea of separate but equal, which Plessy versus Ferguson establishes. So after Plessy versus Ferguson, he still is well known with presidents. He's been an advisor to presidents. He actually then becomes consul to Bordeaux, France, and he will be there the rest of his life. He dies in Bordeaux. He's cremated. His ashes come back to the United States. His ashes, at least, are buried in Mayville, New York. And when I'm there at some point this summer, hopefully, I definitely want to drag my friends who probably won't have any interest in going. I'm going to find the obelisk.
Awesome.
There, marking where his ashes are. But on the obelisk and on the kind of commemoration of it, what it says is, I pray thee then write me as one that loves his fellow man. So he very much wanted to be known for his civil rights activism and work. And in the year of his death, 1905, the civil rights Niagara movement wanted to pay respect to Albion Tourget and the decades of work he did. And the Niagara movement had a memorial service on behalf of what they said, 3 Friends of Freedom. And the 3 people for that were William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and then the last one was Albion Tourget. So he's lesser of the known of those 3, but at the time, very much a leader for 5 decades of civil rights advocacy throughout the South and then throughout the North in various means. And I was wondering, like, why exactly maybe is he not even more well known as a name? One of the historians who were kind of wrote a key book on him, Mark Elliott, he had brought up that when you watch Birth of a Nation, again, a hugely popular film in the 19-teens, a silent film that is a key advocacy for lost cause beliefs, Tourget does get mentioned in Birth of a Nation. So in the opening scenes, when they first show the Ku Klux Klan, it then goes to a kind of descriptor scene. And on that scene, what it says, quote, "The Ku Klux Klan, the organization that saved the South from the anarchy of black rule, but not without the shedding of more blood than at Gettysburg, according to Judge Tourget of the Carpetbaggers."
Wow.
Whoa.
So when you kind of dissect what it says in Birth of a Nation, of course it takes a shot at calling him a carpetbagger, but they're saying, again, the phrase, "but not without the shedding of more blood than at Gettysburg." They're saying that this is like a heroic thing that the Ku Klux Klan has done. As if you ever seen Birth of a Nation, I mean, that is the, crap. There's something.
That's what it's about. Yeah.
But if you read A Fool's Errand, that's where more blood than Gettysburg comes. And again, A Fool's Errand is Tourget's experiences in Reconstruction North Carolina. That is not obviously meant for praise or positive sentiments whatsoever. It is meant to show the violence of the Ku Klux Klan in post 1860s North Carolina. So they
And
took.
what really strikes me about that is like he's enough of a household name, even in what, like 1915 or 16, whenever that movie came out, that like people would know who that is.
Right, or that
After
he's someone that you could try to misconstrue into being, like that he's a big enough name to call in, and it's a quote that you can spin enough to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's
And
not
I
obscure
mean,
by then. He's
I'm
not obscure,
Right.
That
right.
it's whoever's seeing the movie knows who he is. Yeah.
Yeah,
That to me is wild because, like, I mean, I'm not a Civil War expert, but I know enough about
Wow,
the war, and
look
I've
at
never
that.
heard of this dude before. And
yeah, and this is a sketch. I would assume to mock him. Like, I mean, if you ever seen carpetbagger cartoons mocking them, I mean, they always fit similar patterns.
Yeah.
And this is a sketch of Albion Tourget again as a carpetbagger that was done, I think, in the 1870s.
It looks like he's going back north in this one, right? That signpost behind him is like he's running away.
Yeah, I can't remember the year that this was made, so it's either maybe telling him to go back north,
Mhm.
or it could be when he then eventually leaves. I think it was 1879 when they moved temporarily, I think, to Colorado.
I like their attempt to make his rear end look very big,
Yeah,
while the rest of him is small.
yeah. When you see, there's a lot of cartoons about carpetbaggers, and of course, Southerners are angry. They see coming to capitalize on the hardship of the South, but they're also angry because Northerners moved down, of course, to try to implement Reconstruction.
Mhm.
And again, of course, trying to fight against it. And when Reconstruction ends in 77, after the kind of agreement with the election of 1876, that's when they can scale back on a lot of those laws. And that puts Tourget at even more danger physically, but also less recourse with the law to use. This is a picture of Tourget later on in life.
Nice.
And you can actually pretty much tell the similarities between this and that picture from the 105th Ohio.
Yeah.
From the war. So yeah, he's just a fascinating figure that, from my experiences learning about him when I was getting ready to do a program with someone else on Matthews Hill, to always coming back in my mind and been a fascinating figure beyond the fact that he's got a great name. He's also got a great story.
Cool.
Great. All right. Well,
So the
thank you, guys.
carpetbagger.
Yeah. Do we have any questions there, Joe? Anybody in the audience?
Yeah, so someone asked, so like some of those sources too for those photos, I found that one in a public domain. I've been trying to find more images of it. So I did that when I was searching images for Tourget, and I found that one in the public domain. I haven't found it other locations, and the only reason I decided to show it was because of the facial similarities between older pictures of Tourget and what I can see in the photo of the left. I think it's in Mark Elliott's book as well, but I didn't have that on me anymore to look into it. But if you're gonna look, it's called Colorblind Justice by Mark Elliott, if you want more on Tourget.
Very cool. Any other questions?
I have a request that the next time the three of us are in person, which will be on July 23rd at Harper's Ferry Brewing, I think we need to recreate the photo of young Tourget and his friends in the 105th.
Travis,
I'll bring the swords.
Okay. But we gotta find 3 Hardy hats somewhere. I might have one around here somewhere.
We have at least one I know of. Now you spilled the beans on our big news here. Joe, do you want to fill people in on the details?
Yeah, so we're taking, first of all, I'm gonna say we're taking next weekend off. It's 4th of July weekend, but it's also, unless cold feet set in, Anne-Marie's wedding week. So raise a glass to Mike and Anne-Marie who are getting married next week.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Congratulations.
And then the week after that, we're putting it right back to work. We're going to conclude kind of the look of the 4 years of the Civil War with 1865 on July 9th. And Dr. Karina Garcia Esposito is going to be our guest that week. And then 2 weeks after that, on July 23rd, we are making our return in person. In late March, we had planned a talk at Harper's Ferry for History on Tap. Obviously, I don't need to get into why that was canceled along with multiple others, but we're moved into phase 3 and we are having History on Tap at 6 p.m., I believe, at Harper's Ferry on Thursday, July 23rd. It'll be outside. We'll take all the precautions we need, but we're definitely looking forward to getting back in person.
So join us on the 23rd, you know, bring a blanket, grab a beer. It's a wonderful place if you've never been. Beautiful views of Harper's Ferry and of the Shenandoah, the Potomac. It's a really great site. So we hope as many of you who can join us as possible are there. Any other upcoming events we want to talk about? I know we have something tomorrow. Anne-Marie, you look like you want to talk about it, but
I want to talk about it.
Tomorrow, our Live at 5 series with the Mosby Heritage Area continues. Tomorrow we'll be talking with Kyle Dalton from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and we're going to be looking at the aftermath of Second Manassas and how that, you know, kind of influences or revolutionizes military healthcare, care of the wounded, the logistics of evacuating wounded from the battlefield and getting them to hospitals. So it should be a interesting, maybe a little gory discussion, but Kyle's a great historian and we look forward to that. So that's tomorrow at 5.
And if you're not a fan of gore, we have a video about the Aldi Horticultural Society, also known as Aldi Horty, that will go on Sunday afternoon.
Very cool. For the Loudoun Museum, we've got another blog coming for our weekly ones. This week's is going back to looking at education. We've got a guest blog from a Loudoun County school teacher about distant learning. So we're going to keep that going. And I will say we are fully now planning to reopen next Friday. So we're very excited for that. We wanted to make sure we had all the precautions in place. Sorry, I just saw on Facebook someone asked if we're bringing the Eagle cake to Harper's Ferry.
It's a bring your own cake situation. So if you have an eagle cake in a cave that you've been saving, yeah.
Appreciate it if it is in the form of an eagle, though.
But if you want to buy us beers while you're there, we'll take that in lieu of cake. Heidi, what's going on at the DAR right now?
Oh, not a whole lot that is actually in the building, because DC is still in phase 2, which means only 25% of staff can be in a building at one time. But right this week, it's the DAR's annual meeting, Continental Congress. It's the first time it's been held remotely in its history. So that's pretty significant. It's the 129th. Cool. And last night was their opening night, and Dr. Lonnie Bunch gave the opening address. And so that's going on right now. The museum is doing a lot of remote programming right now, and at the end of July, actually, we're going to be doing a remote sort of virtual World's Fair. For the past several years, we've held a World's Fair event because the DAR's origins, one of their first things that they did back in 1890 was to have an exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair. Ah. And the DAR buildings, if you're familiar with what they look like in DC, they look very much like the White City buildings from the World's Fair. So we're kind of riffing off of that.
I love that.
We have all kinds of guests, presenters come in, sharing different cultural customs. We have the Asian Cultural Center and coming, and they're going to be doing a couple, I think, presentations virtually for us. And we have a weaver from Ghana who is going to be doing a presentation for us. We're also having a lecture from Grant Quartermouse, who is a curator at Tudor Place. And he and the Tudor Place, if you don't know Tudor Place, it's the Peters family, who is connected to all kinds of famous people. But he talks about Britannia Peters went to the World's Fair. So he's doing a lecture on her experience at the World's Fair in 1892. So So that's what we're putting together in lieu of the event that usually gets us somewhere between 700 to 1,000 people, which we can't do right now. So we're doing a lot of virtual stuff. So that's what's coming up.
Awesome.
Oh yeah, Tudor Place is a really cool house museum there in Georgetown, and
I love the World's Fair. Like that could be a theme for History on Tap too one night. Do stories of the.
It's fun stuff. I mean, we do when we were able to, obviously, we had a food component because so many firsts with food happened.
Ice cream.
Ice cream.
You're speaking my language right now.
Yeah, we make ice cream. We talk about ice cream. We talk about what was it? Oh, puffed wheat of all things.
Puffed wheat, ice cream on a cone.
Mm-hmm.
There's arguments about public hot dogs, I think, for World.
I feel like 60% of American foods trace back to the World's Fair in Chicago or something like that.
Ferris
wheels.
Ferris wheels, that's a Pittsburgh invention.
Yeah.
I was gonna say Western PA.
So fun.
But yeah, I mean it's a fun event live. So we were trying to figure out how to do it virtually without kind of having it all on one day. So we're doing it some things, for 3 days in a row, so that people can kind of come and go if they like. If they want to do the live stuff, they can tune in, or if they want to do the recorded stuff, then whenever they want. And we do kids stuff and adult related things as well. So something for everybody at least.
And that'll all be on the DAR's Facebook?
Yes.
Great.
DAR Museum Facebook.
DAR Museum
Facebook.
Reminder to everybody to follow us all on Facebook. Check out our websites, join membership if you feel so moved. Thanks again, Heidi, for coming out tonight, or staying in tonight, I guess, technically.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Heidi, I'll leave you with one last note. A friend of mine wanted me to know that in 8th grade, he won the Daughters of the American Revolution Award in school. Probably the last time I ever paid attention to his class.
So let's do a final cheers to that friend and his DAR award.
And we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Well, yeah, 2 weeks.